The Deacon Maxime, our Bishop Maxime, says that in every century the Church takes on a part of the culture that is around. So in every century, though the Church stays the same, we take things from the surrounding culture in which we live. So we're talking about 20th and 21st century. There is a slight problem there. Well, not really slight, it is a problem, is that, you see, Christ, when he became incarnate, he took on human nature, but he did not take on human sin. So what do we take from the culture that's surrounding us that is going to be beneficial? Obviously, over the centuries, we've had the church has supported hospitals. In fact, the church started hospitals, actually. And then there's orphanages, and a lot of social work is helping people, especially today with drug problems. And so the church is involved. There's also a prison ministry, Orthodox prison ministry, which ministers to people in prisons. I did some of that because we had this is a long time. We had parishioners that were not in our parish, but relatives that were in jail, and I went to visit. But I'm not quite sure what we can accept. Now today there are psychological services which are beneficial, and the people that do them and help people have good intentions. So there's nothing sinister about psychological services or social work, of course, and people have the best intention of the world. The only problem is that it's based on a pagan model in most cases, of which most of you, if you're involved in these sort of things, are not aware of the background or the psychology or some of the social ideas. I'm thinking of Emil Durkheim, who was a communist and atheist and very anti-church. A lot of the social work that you're required to study to be a social worker is based on his work. Maybe it's out of date, but certainly when I was covering some sociology, that's what I had to learn. So we're talking about the psychological services without the church, without a patristic background. So if you're working in any of these areas, you must have a patristic background. Now that's not taking a course. It's got nothing to do with study, it's got to do with prayer. And I'm recommending that you read the Desert Fathers. And you read them in a sense not to understand intellectually, not with the mind but with the heart. And over time, when you become familiar with the stories, and some of them are quite outlandish actually by modern standards, you're building up a sort of database spiritually inside you which you would be able to use when you need to. Inspiration favors the prepared mind, and if you're prepared through reading the Fathers and through prayer, then God is able to work through you. And so with your best intentions then become sanctified, and so then you are in a position to do God's work. There are three aspects of the psychological situation. The first one is psychiatry, but psychiatry, actually I want to say there's psychiatry, psychology, and psychotherapy. There are three: psychiatry, psychology, psychotherapy. Unfortunately, the word psyche has been hijacked from church and attached to these three different disciplines, but they don't belong to the disciplines. I'll explain why in a moment. So the title is inappropriate, psychiatry. What does psychiatry do? What does psychiatry study? This is more important. It studies the brain. It is physical. It studies nervous systems, neurotransmitters, etc., etc. And of course it has is important as a medical science. It's very important if people have brain tumours and they can identify things which are serious, related to other diseases. So psychiatry is good. It only becomes suspect when it tries to move into the area of psychology, which does not believe, to the area of therapy, which it does not believe. It has no right to be there. And so, unfortunately, psychiatrists also practice as psychotherapists, and this begins to blur the line between them being medical professionals, because you have to be a doctor, you have to have a medical degree in order to study psychiatry. You don't for the others. You have different degrees in those specialists, but for a doctor, because you're dealing with medical ailments. Psychology basically is observing human behavior. You have the famous Skinner, who did his study on rats, Thorndike, who studied cats and pigeons. They're looking at behavioural aspects of it. There's a whole science there called ethology, which is the study of animal behaviour. And so the psychology studies the behaviour of people on the same level as animals. And Skinner, when I was studying education, was notorious for creating children with rats. Well, we'll leave that open to discussion. The third is psychotherapy. Now, psychotherapy is basically, well, let's put it this way. Unless you're a Christian psychotherapist, you do not believe in the soul. Psychiatrists do not believe in souls, except Christian psychiatrists and Christian psychologists, but basically there is no such thing as soul. So how can you study? All you're doing is studying behavior, but you're trying to interpret it as though it's something spiritual or something deeper. But in fact, the assumptions of psychotherapy are only assumptions. It is not a science, it is philosophy. We can argue and say, well, there's statistical evidence, but statistics is not science. It's not science, it doesn't prove anything. It's an assumption, and so it is a philosophy. This is not saying that this is bad, but the problem with psychotherapy, psychology, psychiatry is that if you don't believe in the soul, there's such a thing as a soul, what are you looking at? You can't study something that doesn't exist. And so the whole level of this is a much low-level science, or I would say philosophy, which is based on animal behavior. And so man is seen as some sick animal that needs to be treated. Or, according to Freud, man is a machine that needs fixing. He's a machine driven by sexual drives, by anger, and many other things. And so his whole thing is, person is not a person, but is a determined machine. These are extremes, okay, examples of it, but that's basically hidden in the language of Freud in particular. So how does the church see this situation? How does the church deal with psychiatry, psychology, psychotherapy? How does the church deal with brain tumours? How does it relate to it? How does the church relate to behaviour that's getting closer to the spiritual disciplines? And finally, how does the church see the soul? We believe there is a soul. Now, St. Gregory the Theologian, who we commemorated today, he says that the soul is the breath of God. When God created Adam, he created him from the physical elements, and he became a living soul, but it wasn't until God breathed into Adam that he became a person. And so what distinguishes us from a dog or a cat is that we have divine spirit in us, breathe the breath of God in us. Now, if you're studying somebody's problems, in psychiatry or in psychotherapy in particular, you're dealing with the animal side of nature, not the soul. And the church's teaching is that, well, let's quote St. John of Damascus. He says that the soul is made up of essence, which is the breath of God, and energies. Now, as energies is what we have in common with all animals. For animals, it's called instinct. We have impulses. These are animal traits which are part of the energies of a person. Energy, anger, hunger, thirst, all these things, they're called energies, and they are the same as animals. If an animal dies, and I'm sorry to say that even if you have a pet animal, it does not carry on. When it dies, the energies stop, and there's nothing there anymore. Disintegrates. When we die, we have essence, because we are divine, and so we share in the essence of the Creator, not in God's essence. His essence in itself, but we also have an essence which is the breath of God, and so when we die, that continues. The energies of the body disintegrate, although we're told that even the bodies will be resurrected, but there will be spiritual bodies. So the soul has three theological points. This one I want to talk about 3 points. The first one is that every soul has energies, which is behavior, putting it very crudely, and essence, which is the divine in us, which responds to God. The second point is motion. This is fascinating, is that the soul is always moving. And we move, we've been given motion because God is moving. God is eternal. God is never ending. So he doesn't sit observing the world and us. He's moving all the time. And when we are with God in heaven, we are moving to greater. The Holy Apostle Paul says we move from glory to glory. Now our concern here in this life now is glory. The first glory is to be divine like God, so that we can be with God. If we don't have any glory, divinity in us, we cannot be with God. But we're assuming throughout our struggles, our prayer and communion, Ispavid, all these things will direct us towards God, and so that we'll have glory. But that's not the end of it. When we die and we go to heaven, we don't stop. There's more to come. In fact, there's never ending. I mean, but we cannot obviously conceive what that really means. But it doesn't end there. Another third point. First point is the composition of the soul, which is energy, and essence and energy. The second is motion. We're always moving. This is why we're struggling. We're not sitting still all the time, and now I'm Christian, so this is it. No, we're moving forward. We're struggling with sin. We're moving. There's a continuous motion. This is also called creativity. It's natural for us to be creative because the Creator, we're like made in the image of God, so we should be creative. That could be from cooking to painting, writing symphonies, playing music, whatever, anything creative. We all have that within us. Whether we use it or not, that's a different thing. The third point is sensuality. Now, as soon as we say the word sensuality, we're thinking something sexual or something even depraved, but it's not. The sensuality is what God gives us, so that we have a desire. I think desire probably is a better word. So we have this desire to be like God, and to be with God. We have that desire, and that is how we strive. And that desire should be towards God. It should be vertical. It should be ascending, going up. When we do not turn our desire on God, then we go horizontal. And so we stay on animal level. We fall into sin. So our desire is for food, sex, anything that's going to be stimulated, but what's the difference between that and an animal? The animal can't help it because it only has energy. It doesn't have an essence. It doesn't have godness. It doesn't understand. So when we descend, if we use our desires, instead of going up towards God, they go horizontal, they spread out. That's how we fall into sin. 3 points. Essence, energy. Motion, because everything is continuing motion. In fact, it's interesting because if in modern, I'm not averse with, but I know in modern astrology, the universe doesn't end; it's actually expanding. To me, that's very much like what this is the idea of motion.
Astronomy, not astrology.
Did I say astrology?
Mm-hmm.
Delete astronomy. Amazing, everything's moving. And nothing is still. They were sitting in a hard chair. In fact, the molecules inside the chair are moving, the atoms. But they move so slowly that they look solid or become solid. If you've ever read anything on quantum physics, it becomes very much like what we're talking about, what the church is teaching about motion. In fact, very much so. So in psychology and psychotherapy, it only recognizes the energy because there is no soul. And you know the word psyche, it means in Greek is soul. But as I say, that's been hijacked to make it into a science. I think the other problem is that with psychiatry, because staying within the physical aspect is fine. I mean, obviously people have brain tumours and have disturbances, and there's, nervous disorders, and then neurologists, and this is very important. But when it starts moving into the world of philosophy, based on assumptions and not on scientific knowledge, it ceases to be science. And in fact, the trouble with psychology is that it's been using what I call a medical metaphor. So we're talking about mental illness. Well, illness is associated with physical illness. There's no such thing as mental illness. I think the term is wrong. I'm not saying people are not disturbed. I'm talking about this is thought disturbance. So how do you deal with that? The first thing you do is probably go to the doctor and have a checkup. If, say, you're suffering from acute depression, chronic depression, clinical depression, doesn't matter how you define it, you go to the doctor for a checkup, because very often it can be something physical that's affecting you. Bad diet. But if it's not that, then how do you deal with it? If you don't believe in the soul, what can you do? There's no cure, in other words. You may alleviate the pains, and I'm not undermining that because it's important. You may stop somebody from committing suicide, stop people jumping off buildings. But you can't cure that urge to do it because it's spiritual and it is part of the soul. So I think, what can we take from society around us today? But very little, I think. I don't know, I'm open to suggestions, but I don't see what we can learn from the culture around us. In fact, I think it's rather destructive. If you don't believe in the soul and you think everything can be solved by chemical, mind-altering drugs, then what can you do? That's why I think people are on these things for life, because there's no alternative. So we need Christians in these professions. The psychotherapist in particular has to deal with this problem, which they can't cure. They can alleviate the symptoms, but as somebody said, that the psychotherapist, the Christian psychotherapist, is a bridge to the priest. And so the only cure, and it is the only cure, is confession, and that's directly from God. And the priest is just the mediator. When I went to this talk last year, they were saying how important the priest should study psychology in order to be able to function in a parish. And I didn't ask the question, but I wanted to say, yes, but which one? Because there's 250 of different schools of thought. So which one do we adopt? But I didn't ask because that would be controversial. I don't think it's been thought through. When people are hearing confession and they say, well, I can't deal with it, I have to send them to a psychiatrist. Well, not a psychiatrist, but a psychologist. And that is because they do not understand the grace of confession, the grace of the priesthood. I'm talking about priests, I'm not talking about you, I'm talking about priests. They don't feel that they're capable, because what are they measuring it by? Knowledge or prayer? What are they measuring it by? By so-called qualifications? or through the grace that comes with the priesthood. If a priest thinks he's capable of doing something, then it's absolutely wrong, because priest is in the hands of God. It's God that works. And I've said to you, even in your own work, that sometimes when things work, it's because God's working through you. If you pray before you meet your clients, then you're opening yourself up to prayer. You're opening yourself up to God being able to work through you. The same with doctors. Healing is a gift from God. It's not based on necessarily studying pharmacopoeia, all the various drugs that can be used and various surgeries. Not that these things are not important, but they're not the basis of this. We're dealing with people, we're not dealing with animals. But while we have this model of the people are like animals, and that they can be treated by drugs or psychoanalysis, in fact they can't, because it's ignoring the total person. And it is a tragedy that some of our young priests, young clergy, are afraid of these situations and don't know what to do. And maybe there's some senior priests who can help, but the priesthood is a gift from God. It's not something you can learn. And also it does not work without the support of the people. Without the love of the people, then there is a synergy there. And as I said to you before, that in confession, when you come to confession, you receive grace. And not only you receive grace, but the priest does at the same time. And then it becomes a connecting, a synergy between the penitent, person confessing, and the priest, which is impossible at any other social level. I think you'll agree. I've known some of you for a long time now, 14, 15 years. We have a relationship that's built up over the years. And it's based on love and trust. I have to trust God work through me. Without that I couldn't do it, you think. You have to trust the same thing. And you can't measure the result by me as a person, but you can through the priesthood, you can through confession. So this is important. I don't know how one would teach young priests to do this, to be conscious of it. Are there any questions?
You mentioned also, so how would it treat? Because at some point you said also how would the sacerdote, the priest, treat actually some of this mental.
The priest has to be grounded in patristics. The psychotherapist has to be grounded in patristics. And as I say, studying patristics is not studying in the normal sense of acquiring knowledge, or somebody said this, somebody said that. It's a part, you absorb it, and even though you don't understand it. And I think in some cases it's best when you don't understand it, you just read it and think, I don't know. And then suddenly it becomes a part of you. That's my experience. When I first started at St. Nicholas, and I was hearing confessions, I had to hear confessions in Russian, which is obvious, the Russian church. I didn't even have the vocabulary for sin. I started, but whenever, this is interesting because I would read something from the fathers or contemporary Russian saints, and whatever I read, I guarantee that would come up in confession. And so, and on a practical level, I would have the terminology, vocabulary and phraseology, and people think, oh, you're fluent Russian, in the spiritual sense. You can't make that up. And even now, I still read things, and I, like a talk, I read these things and I prepare, and then they come up again in confession. This is again trusting God that God will work through you. Otherwise, there's no point. You end up, becoming a philosopher. Does that answer your question?
Yes, but what would the people who are outside of the church? I mean, there are not few people who actually are not inside the church, or they have a relationship or even they know this exists, or it can exist?
I don't know. What can you do? No.
Well, maybe I can answer. You know, there's a lot of conversations at my work. Basically, that the people who experience trauma in childhood, they carry over this trauma and have to be in treatment, in trauma therapy of some kind, all of their lives.
Yeah.
And I'm asking myself, so Second World War or Third World War, actually all the history of mankind, people were undergoing a huge amount of deep trauma. They were able to recover without trauma therapy because trauma therapy is recent, and they were able to produce the next generation. Healthy generation has been going for 1,000 years. And, well, I know right now there is some movement, they study resilience, the natural ability of the body to recover after trauma. They just started, I believe. But there is something, we have a soul, and it helps us to recover when nothing else is available. Everybody has soul, so God helps us. If God wouldn't help us during the history of mankind, we wouldn't be existing.
Wouldn't
right?
be here.
Yes, right, by now, for many thousand years already. Because we're so killing people. Yeah. So I do believe that if somebody doesn't know or they don't have access to the church, still they have this, their soul, and soul helps them to recover because they don't have access. Because God loves everybody who has access to the churches and who doesn't. God, grace is for everybody. Yeah, I don't know. Am I correct?
Yeah, yes. This is an opportunity open to respond to it. What would you think, Danny? And add to this.
I think there's still value in the relationship with the clinician.
Yes.
The actual experience, the
Relationship, yes.
relationship and the experience. I think that can be healing on some level.
Yes.
And like the bridge you were mentioning. But the cure is the definite cure of a problem is not in the clinician's hands, obviously.
Yeah.
What do you think about medication for depression? In terms of people who are suicidal, really at that place and come in our office.
Well, I don't like the idea of medication
know.
because it's actually suppressing animal instincts.
Sure,
and
it's
not-
getting to that
to
biological.
that biological cause for things which I don't accept. And my concern is the mind-altering drugs
Right.
that people then become dependent on. And so whereas like Prozac, for example,
Right.
I've had to say to somebody, not here, but in the past, who am I confessing, you or Prozac?
The substance,
Yeah, the
basically, that's
substance.
behind
Yes,
that.
yes, yeah.
Well, recent studies have indicated that the drug therapy doesn't do anything about the depression anyway. I mean, it's, how do I want to say it? I was just reading about this a couple of weeks ago. That recent studies, I mean, it's essentially, if you, it's not addressing what the real issue is anyway. And you could essentially go to the older methods of take a shower, go for a walk,
Yes, yeah.
kind of things that don't build up certain kind of dependencies, as you mentioned. I mean, these are within the own field because you can look over a long period of 20 years and it's not the cure that people had anticipated.
And is it a medical condition or can it be demonic?
Right.
If you have no defense against demonic suggestion, what do you do? And if it's suicide, I think that is demonic.
Right. People who go to the ER every hour as we speak with
Yes.
a crisis,
Yes.
they don't want
Yes.
to take their lives. Yeah, what do they do? I mean, you go
Yeah,
to
when
the
my-
medical.
When my
Approach.
grandmother, my grandfather died, and grandmother died 6 months after him, but after a while, after a year or so, I came to that house and I found some drugs in her house. She was prescribed antidepressants,
Yeah.
right? And I don't know if she was taking it or not, but I knew it's there.
Yes.
And at some point I had very stressful situation. I mean, like, very stressful situation. And I was like, okay, let's try it. And I took half of the pill. And it was amazing. In a way, that it just calms you down.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I was really surprised with the effect, because I didn't expect to see any effect.
No,
or
the effect.
whatever.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
And it's, I don't know if it's helping or not, but if you think about addiction, it's really scary stuff.
It's very scary.
Yeah. I mean, it helped me at that moment. I like took
Cold,
once and
whatever,
that's it,
yeah.
right? But it was like, wow. Yeah. It just changed you. It's like you say,
Well,
it
I
takes
think
part of you.
biologically it opens up the receptors.
It does, the neurotransmitters
Yes, it
receptors,
does,
yeah, yeah. It bumps the levels
Bumps
in
the
the
levels,
neurons,
yes.
yeah, immediately.
Yeah.
So
There
some of
was-
them,
Yeah, if
yeah.
someone in a situation when they need medical intervention, it's the right tool to use. But long time use.
the immediate, the emergency kind of,
Right.
the crisis mode, but not
Yeah.
long term.
Not
Obviously,
long-term.
that's a whole other.
It's very complicated.
It is a whole other.